The world had shrunk to the space between two heartbeats. My name is Dmitri Volkov, or it was. That Dmitri was a boy who loved the clean logic of numbers, the elegant certainty of a proven theorem. He lived in Leningrad in a world of lecture halls and ink-stained fingers. That world burned. The Dmitri that huddled in the mud of the MGA salient was something else entirely, a sapper, a solver of crude, violent problems. And this problem, crouching in the gray morning mist ahead of us, was the ugliest I had ever seen. It was a German strongpoint, a pillbox of reinforced concrete that the Politruck had named the Fang. It squatted on a low rise, commanding the swampy no-man's land we had to cross. For 2 days it had chewed up our riflemen, its MG-42s spitting fire in long, metronomic bursts. It was an anchor holding the whole German line in place, and it was my job to pull it. I remember the smell of the trench that morning, not just the usual stench of damp wool, stale tobacco, and fear. It was the smell of the swamp itself, a living, breathing decay. The earth here wasn't solid. It was a sponge of peat and mud, and every shell that landed sent a tremor through it, a liquid shudder that made my teeth ache. It felt like being in a half-dug grave, and my deepest fear, the cold, suffocating dread of being buried alive, was a constant passenger in my gut. I checked my kit for the third time. Fuses, detonators, the heavy, greasy blocks of trottle, each piece was an axiom, a known quantity. My tools were the only things that made sense in this madness. My mind, I tried to make it a quiet room, a lecture hall where I was both student and professor, working on a final, critical proof. The lieutenant, a man whose face was a roadmap of exhaustion, unrolled the blueprint on a crate. It was a flimsy, rain-spotted thing, a copy of a copy captured from a German pioneer weeks ago. He jabbed a dirty finger at the schematic. Here, Volkov, this is the ventilation shaft. Intelligence says it's the weak point. Get your charge in there and the whole thing comes down. I leaned in closer. My university training screamed at me. The drawing was incomplete. The lines showing the interior support structure were smudged, almost illegible. The thickness of the western wall was a question mark. It was like trying to solve an equation with unknown variables. To place a charge based on this was not engineering, it was gambling. And the stakes were the lives of the assault team that would follow me. Comrade Lieutenant, I began, my voice quiet. This schematic, it doesn't show the load-bearing pillars. If I place the main charge based on this, the blast could vent outwards, not inwards. It might just annoy them, and if I use too much to compensate, the shockwave could collapse the forward trench where our men are waiting. He stared at me, his eyes hollow. The attack goes in 30 minutes, with or without a hole. This is what we have, make it work, make it work. The Red Army's favorite phrase. It was an order, not a suggestion. I looked at the blueprint again. It wasn't about what was there, but what wasn't. The German engineers who built it were not fools. They would follow principles of structural integrity. I could see it in my mind's eye, the likely placement of rebar, the way the ceiling's weight would be distributed. I started sketching in the dirt with a stick, running calculations in my head, stress vectors, blast containment, the physics problem from hell. My escort was a Siberian rifleman named Pavel. He was as wide as a doorframe and said nothing, just chewed on a piece of straw and watched me with flat, patient eyes. Together, we slipped over the parapet. The world outside the trench was a monochrome nightmare. Splintered birches stuck out of the mud like broken bones. The air was thick with mist and the smell of cordite. We crawled, my body pressed low against the trembling earth. Each crump of a distant mortar sent a fresh wave of that claustrophobic terror through me. The ground was trying to swallow me. I focused on the problem. I had to visualize the bunker not as a tomb, but as a structure. A set of principles. The crawl felt like an eternity. The Fang loomed closer, a concrete cyclops. The air grew sharp with the whine of ricochets. Pavel was my shadow, a silent, deadly guardian. We reached the ditch at the base of the pillbox. Above, the MG-42 opened up again, a sound like a giant tearing a canvas sheet. The ground vibrated with its fury. My breath was ragged, catching in my throat. I pressed my face against the cold, rough concrete. It was like putting your ear to a monster's chest. I could feel the vibrations of the men and the machinery inside. I found the ventilation shaft. It was exactly where the blueprint said it would be. A small victory, but as I ran my fingers around the steel grate, my heart sank. It was smaller than depicted and reinforced. I could never fit the main charge through it. The blueprint was a lie, or at least a dangerous half-truth. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold. The plan was useless. The men in the trench were counting the seconds. I closed my eyes, breath threw out the bad data. The shaft was a dead end. I had to reevaluate. I crawled along the base of the wall, my gloved fingers tracing the seams in the concrete. Where would I have put the main support? Not the corners, that was too obvious. The Germans were efficient. They would place it where the stress was greatest, at the midpoint of the longest wall, creating an internal T-junction to support the roof. It was a logical assumption, a theoretical solution, and it was all I had. I pulled out the shaped charges, smaller ones. I wouldn't bring the whole thing down in one go. That was too risky. This had to be a controlled demolition, a sequence. First, I would use a small charge to breach the outer wall at my calculated weak point. Then through the hole I would place the main charge, right against the theoretical pillar. A third charge, smaller on a delayed fuse, would be placed by the machine gun slit, not to destroy, but to disorient, to force the crew to duck at the critical moment. It was a three-part harmony of destruction, all timed to fractions of a second, a complex, cascading equation. Pavel watched me, his face unreadable. He had no idea of the furious mathematics storming through my mind. He just saw a sapper doing his job. My hands, miraculously, were steady. I packed the breaching charge against the concrete, the putty-like explosive cold and pliable. I set the fuse. Then I moved to the slit, setting the second. Every movement was precise, deliberate. The only thing that betrayed my terror was the sweat trickling into my eyes, stinging like acid. Then came the hard part. I crawled back to the breaching charge, lit the fuse, and scrambled for cover, dragging Pavel with me. The second stretched, the ground heaved with a sharp crack, not a boom. Dust and concrete chips rained down. Peering through the smoke, I saw it, a ragged hole, barely big enough for a man to shove his arm through. It was exactly where I calculated the outer wall was thinnest. Now, time was gone. There was only the roar of the battle and the frantic beating of my own heart. I scrambled back to the hole. The air from inside was hot and smelled of gun oil and sweat. I couldn't see anything, just blackness. I armed the main charge, a heavy, deadly brick of trottle with a 10-second fuse. 10 seconds. An eternity to think, not enough time to run. This was the moment of faith. Faith in my education. Faith in the ghost of a professor who once told me that mathematics was the language of the universe. I shoved the charge through the hole, feeling it land on the floor inside. I prayed it was leaning against the invisible pillar I had mapped in my head. I lit the fuse. Its hiss was the deadliest sound I had ever heard. "Go," I screamed at Pavel, not even looking to see if he was moving. I ran. I didn't run like a soldier. I ran like a terrified boy, clumsy and desperate, my feet sinking into the mud. The world was a blur of gray smoke and splintered wood. 5 seconds. My lungs burned. 4. I could feel the coming explosion on my skin. 3. I threw myself headfirst into a shell crater. 2. The earth became a drum. 1. First, a sharp crack from the front, the disorientation charge, and then, a heartbeat later, the main event. It was not a loud explosion. It was a deep, guttural whumph, a sound that was felt more than heard. The ground beneath me bucked like a living animal. A wave of pressure slammed into my back, stealing the air from my lungs. For a sickening moment, the crater walls seemed to crumble inwards, and the terror of being buried, of the dark earth filling my mouth, seized me completely. Then silence, a profound, ringing silence that was more shocking than the noise. Slowly, I lifted my head. The air was thick with gray cement dust, so thick it was hard to breathe. Where the fang had been, there was now a ruin. The roof had collapsed inwards, exactly as I had theorized. A single, jagged piece of concrete pointed to the sky like a broken tooth. It hadn't blown outwards, it had imploded. My equation was correct. A whistle blew. The first wave of our men rose from the trenches, their bayonets fixed, their guttural cutting through the silence. They ran past my crater, their faces grim, charging into the gap I had made. Pavel was beside me, clapping me on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. He was grinning, a rare and shocking sight. I couldn't smile back. I started to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that began in my bones. My hands, which had been so steady, now shook so badly I couldn't clench them into fists. I had solved the problem. I had used the logic I learned in a peaceful, sunlit room to create a perfect, calculated moment of violence. I felt a surge of cold, professional pride, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. I was no longer Dmitry Volkov, the student. I was Sapper Volkov of the 41st, a tool that worked. And something inside me, some part of the boy who loved the simple beauty of numbers, was now buried forever in the rubble of that German concrete. These memories are heavy, but they must be shared. Subscribe to ensure these stories are never forgotten.